Welcome back to Cheddar's Opening Bell, everyone. We're just 3 days away from the start of COP26 in Glasgow, Scotland, where the world leaders will meet to discuss the fight against climate change. Yet huge new fossil fuel exploration and extraction projects are being financed across the world. As world economies transition to net zero, a group of prominent academics and activists are calling on banks and insurers to take special precautions around climate risks. The group sent an open letter to various stakeholders Wednesday calling for one-to-one capital requirements on all new fossil fuel investments. Joining us now with more on this is our own Alex Vuocolo. Alex, good to have you here this morning. Thanks for joining. Break down what a one-to-one capital requirement means to start and how this applies to banks and insurers in terms of climate risks.
Hey, Brad. So a one-to-one capital requirement would mean that every dollar invested in a new fossil fuel project would need to be backed by a matching dollar in reserves to guard against future risks. This kind of rule is usually reserved for the riskiest investments, but the letter argues that for a number of reasons, fossil fuel extraction and production should now qualify. The argument is that climate change creates two different types of risks for fossil fuels. One is commonly called transition risk, which is basically the increasing possibility that governments will crack down on the sector as the consensus around taking action on climate change builds. And the other is physical or disruption risks, which are actual losses sustained on banks' balance sheets from climate-related impacts such as forest fires and floodings. On both counts, the risks are already playing out in real time, as almost anybody can see, but the letter's authors are betting that they will only increase in the coming years, and banks should be preparing now rather than later.
So Alex, has there been any pushback to this proposal?
So some commentators have pushed back on the idea that banks should take a leading role in combating climate change and that governments instead should be leading the charge. But as the writers of the letter stress, the goal of a one-to-one requirement isn't designed to replace government action with new financial regulations, but rather to ensure that the world economy doesn't collapse during the transition away from fossil fuels. Because of banks' and insurers' systemic role in the economy, any massive destabilizing loss due to climate change would likely mean government bailouts or other interventions. In other words, bank losses would mean taxpayer liabilities if banks don't start preparing now. At the same time, banks have also caused for more data collecting before any hard requirement is put in place, but some now argue this process is dragging too long and regulators should be making a move now to get the process started.
So what's the progress so far in making this a reality, and what changes can we expect to see in capital requirements in the future?
So no hard and fast rules have been implemented so far, but one of the reasons this letter is going out now, in addition to the fact that the UN climate conference is starting next week, is that there are some serious opportunities on the horizon for change. One is that the European Commission this week released draft laws that aim to reform capital requirements by 2025 with the goal of increasing capital buffers and pushing banks towards taking sustainability concerns more seriously. In the U.S., meanwhile, acting comptroller of the currency, Michael Hsu, said back in June that banks should, quote, eventually have to account for climate change in their capital requirements. All this suggests that momentum is building for some kind of increased capital requirement around climate change. And while it might not be the one-to-one rule suggested in this letter, many anticipate that some kind of rule change is coming soon.
Alex Vuocolo, Cheddar Zone, thanks so much for joining us to break all of this down and ahead of a very big COP26 meeting that's set to take place. And everyone, don't forget, join us for a special edition of Cheddar Climate next week, November 2nd, 2 p.m. Eastern, as we cover all of the major developments coming from the UN Climate Change Conference.